It is August 11th, 1964. Work begins on Babies in Black, the first song recorded for the Beatles' fourth UK release, Beatles for Sale. And when you are the Beatles in 1964, there is no such thing as a break.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you.
Since the UK release of Please Please Me on March 22nd, 1963, to the day we are now on, August 11th, 1964, the Beatles have spent 253 days playing live. This is not including the radio and TV show appearances, of which there were numerous mini, or recording sessions, or the filming of A Hard Day's Night, which took a couple of months, not even travel. 253 days, standing before a screaming, manic crowd, often more than one performance per day. Or, to put it another way, essentially 50% of their days since releasing Please Please Me have been spent performing live. Oh, and by the way, in a week, they are leaving for San Francisco for the second leg of their US tour. Welcome to the making of Beatles for Sale. The Beatles arrived at the studio at 7 p.m. and began work on a Lennon-McCartney composition written in a hotel room while on tour, Babies in Black. Paul, we wanted to write something a little bit darker, bluesy. The title's dark anyways. It's in 3/4 time, one of the first waltzes we wrote, which was interesting for us because most of our stuff is in 4/4. I better explain what John and I meant by this title, hadn't I? The story is about a girl who's wearing black because the bloke she loves has gone away forever. The feller singing the song fancies her, but he's getting nowhere. The song took 14 takes to finish, though only 5 of the takes were to completion, as they had some difficulty getting the very beginning, the distinctive twangy guitar from George, sounding the way they'd like. George tried a few different variations of the note, bending it with his tremolo arm, with George Martin remarking, "You want the beginning like that, do you?" Which, despite the note of judgment, speaks to the shifting dynamic between the band and Martin, as just a year prior, he would be far more inclined just to say, "Don't do it like that." The song consists of an unusual end-to-end vocal duet by John and Paul, including the incredible bridge, with some of the best harmonies ever recorded for a Beatles song. To add to this, rather than recording the two vocals on separate mics, John and Paul stood side by side and sang into the same mic, contributing to that feeling of closeness. Let's add one final note here with an excerpt of writing from musicologist Alan W. Pollack, who has contributed an enormous wealth of valuable knowledge regarding musical theory in the Beatles' music. Here he talks about George's guitar solo. For a guy who made such a specialty of the well-practiced kind of solo that is the most understated, delicate paraphrase of the tune, George really lets go here with a solo whose only obvious connection to the original refrain melody is to be found in the lilting cadence of its rhythmic pattern. Otherwise, in place of the predominantly stepwise melodic arch performed by the singers, we get a guitar part that is not only full of long jumps, but is also peppered through with bent notes and free dissonances against the underlying chords. All in all, a worthy contrast with the surrounding sections. This is a very divisive song, but personally, I adore it. When they came into the studio on Friday, August 14th, they tackled 3 different songs, though only one was an original, that being Lennon's I'm a Loser. That's me in my Dylan period. Part of me suspects I'm a loser, and part of me thinks I'm God Almighty.
I'm a loser, take one.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So, okay, that's how we do it. Because I'll stop on the 1, 2. So,
2.
1, 2, 1, 2. I'm a loser.
Up next was Mr. Moonlight, everybody's favorite song on the album. They recorded a few takes of the song, but were not happy with the results on this day. And then finally, Leave My Kitten Alone, featuring a fantastic Lennon lead vocal, and is a cover track many believe should have made the album over a song such as Mr. Moonlight. It was to be a good while before the Beatles returned to the studio, as following a performance at the Opera House in Blackpool, the Beatles jetted off to the Cow Palace in San Francisco, and with that began the second leg of their first US tour. If the Beatles thought the Jelly Baby peltings of their prior performances were over, they were sadly mistaken.
George, there's been some remarks accredited to the Beatles that you aren't too appreciative of all the jelly beans being thrown at you on your tour.
No, it's a bit dangerous, because jelly bean traveling about 50 miles an hour through the air, if it hits you in the eye, well, you're finished, you're blind, aren't you?
The show was stopped after 29 minutes due to the number of candies that littered the stage. It was madness in the Cow Palace. Around 50 fans were injured, 2 were arrested, and many more had to be prevented from rushing the stage. As the Beatles ran out and rushed to their limousine, they found it surrounded by a horde of fans and had to be smuggled out in an ambulance and taken to their hotel room. Welcome back to America, boys. They didn't get a break until August 24th, where they attended a party hosted by Capitol Records president Alan Livingston, held in aid of the Hemophilia Foundation of Southern California. There actually exists footage of the event, which I have shown in a prior video.
And you knew that they were here by the fact that some of your peers, other kids, were up here, right?
Yeah, they told us.
So that was your clue?
Yeah.
You glad you saw them?
Yeah, I wish I could see them come out, though. I wanted to get another picture of them.
Why do you want to see them so badly? What is it about them that attracts you so?
Oh, I don't know. They're cute and have good voices, and I don't know.
The next day, they visited Burt Lancaster at his home and watched Peter Sellers' film, A Shot in the Dark. Later, they swung by a club, Whiskey A Go-Go, at the invitation of actress Jane Mansfield. This stop is notable for an incident in which George Harrison threw a glass of water at a photographer and inadvertently hit actress Mamie Van Doren in the process. Here's George. Somebody conned us into going to the Whiskey A Go-Go. It seemed to take us 20 minutes to get from the door to the table, and instantly the whole of Hollywood paparazzi descended. It was a total setup by Jane Mansfield to have pictures taken with us. John and I were sitting either side of her, and she had her hands on our legs, by our groins. At least she did on mine. We'd been sitting there for hours, waiting to get a drink. We had glasses with ice in them, and the ice had all melted. A photographer came and tried to get a picture, and I threw the glass of water at him. He took a photo of the water coming out of the glass and soaking, accidentally, the actress Mamie Van Doren, who just happened to be passing. We got out of there. It was hell. We left town the next day, and I remember sitting on the plane, reading the newspaper, and there was the photo of me throwing the water. But we'll now skip all the way to the 28th, a day that may very well have changed the course of music history as we know it. The Beatles were staying at the Delmonico Hotel on Park Avenue.
It has been said that the Beatles are a threat to public safety. What do the Beatles feel about it?
Rubbish.
Rubbish.
It's got to be one word, huh?
Bob Dylan was to be introduced to the Beatles by a mutual friend, writer Al Aronowitz.
Al Aronowitz was there, he was a journalist, who was like a mate.
On arrival, the Beatles offered Dylan a drink, but he expressed a preference for cheap wine, which they did not have. But he drank regardless. The Beatles then offered him some Purple Hearts, or amphetamines, which the Beatles were very familiar with at that point. Instead, Bob suggested they smoke some grass.
That was the first time for me that I'd really smoked marijuana. And I laughed, and I laughed, and I laughed.
We'll read now an excerpt from band manager Peter Brown's book, The Love You Make. Brian and the Beatles looked at each other apprehensively. We've never smoked marijuana before, Brian finally admitted. Dylan looked disbelievingly from face to face. But what about your song? He asked. The one about getting high. The Beatles were stupefied. Which song? John managed to ask. Dylan said, "You know," and then he sang, "And when I touch you, I get high, I get high." John flushed with embarrassment. "Those aren't the words," he admitted. "The words are, I can't hide, I can't hide, I can't hide." Wary of the police outside the door, Dylan suggested they all move into a bedroom, and so the 10 of them, Dylan, his friends Aronowitz and Mahmoods, Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, Starr, Brian, Neil Aspinall, and Mal Evans all crammed inside. Dylan lit the first joint and passed it to John. It was immediately given to Ringo. They didn't realize the etiquette was to pass the joint around, and Ringo smoked it as if it were a cigarette. Aronowitz asked Mahmoods to make more joints, and soon everybody had their own. Chaos would ensue for the rest of the day.
It was a great honor to meet him. We had a crazy party the night we met.
Brian Epstein kept repeating, "I'm so high I'm on the ceiling. I'm up on the ceiling." Paul in particular seemed to experience some sort of breakthrough, as he said that he felt he was thinking for the first time, really thinking.
I thought I got the meaning to life that night. And I went around trying to find our roadie. Mal, get a pencil and a paper. I've got it. And Mal, because we're a bit out of it, he couldn't find a pencil and paper anywhere. But eventually, in the end of the evening, he found it, and I wrote down my message for the universe, you know. I said, "Now keep that in your pocket." And Mal did. The next morning, he said, "Hey, Paul," he said, "do you want to see that?" I said, "What?" He said, "That bit of paper." "Oh, yeah." And I'd written, "There are 7 levels."
And we pissed ourselves laughing. I mean, what the fuck is that? What the fuck are the 7 levels? Tour continued. On August 30th, they played in Atlantic City, New Jersey. They left their hotel in the back of a fish truck, and then after the show returned in a laundry truck. Luxury at its finest. They would have the next day off and stayed at the Marquis de Lafayette. It was here that John and Paul wrote 2 songs, Every Little Thing and What You're Doing. Every Little Thing, like most of the stuff I did, was my attempt at the next single. I remember playing it for Brian backstage somewhere. It was one of those meetings. "Oh, we have to do some recordings. Who's got what?" And we played a few at Brian. We didn't often check things with Brian. In fact, I just remember it in connection with this because I thought it was very catchy. I played it amongst a few songs. It was something I thought was quite good, but it became an album filler rather than the great almighty single. It didn't have quite what was required. And in regard to What You're Doing, Paul said, "We wrote this one in Atlantic City just like Every Little Thing. It's not that Atlantic City is particularly inspiring. It's just that we happened to have a day off the tour there." Flash forward to the 8th of September as the Beatles flew into Montreal, Canada. It had been a restful week of daily performances, jelly baby beatings, as well as larger objects being thrown, all the while being smuggled from hotel rooms to venues and back. And now here they receive another lovely surprise. Death threats, courtesy of French-Canadian separatists.
Yeah, there was all kinds of stuff. You know, we flew out of Montreal in order to avoid Ringo getting killed.
We were playing Canada, and they decided to make an example of me as an English Jew. One major fault is I'm not Jewish. And we were playing the gig, and I was always on a high riser, and I had a cop, plainclothes policeman, sitting there with me. Now I was worried. It's the first time. It's one of the times I was really worried because I had the cymbals a bit like this, so give me a bit of protection. Usually they're like this, but I had them up. But this guy, and then I started getting hysterical because I thought, well, if someone in the audience has a pop at me, what is this guy going to do? He's going to catch the bullet. What is he going to do?
On the 10th, the Beatles had a rest day in Key West, Florida. That night, John and Paul got pissed drunk and shared a rare, vulnerable moment with each other. Let's hear it from Paul. "We were in Key West in 1964. We were due to fly into Jacksonville, in Florida, and do a concert there, but we'd been diverted because of a hurricane. We stayed there for a couple of days, not knowing what to do except, drink. I remember drinking way too much and having one of those talking to the toilet bowl evenings. It was during that night when we'd all stayed up way too late, and we got so pissed that we ended up crying about, how wonderful we were and how much we loved each other, even though we'd never said anything. It was a good one. You never say anything like that, especially if you're a northern man. Their performance on the 15th in Cleveland, Ohio, marked the first time a show had to be stopped due to real safety concerns. A police line of over 100 people attempted to keep the fans from the stage, but was slowly pushed back by the crowd. A handful broke through and rushed onto the stage. Concerned for the Beatles' safety, Inspector Michael Blackwell and Deputy Inspector Carl Baer decided to stop the concert. Baer walked onto the stage and took a microphone, telling the crowd that the show was over and to sit down. At the time, the Beatles were performing All My Loving, and continued to play despite the police's wishes. Blackwell also arrived on stage and gestured to the Beatles to stop performing. They reluctantly put down their instruments and temporarily left the stage, amid the sound of booing fans. In their dressing room backstage, John Lennon told the local radio station KYW, "This has never happened to us before. We have never had a show stopped. These policemen are a bunch of amateurs." And angry Brian Epstein nonetheless put up a diplomatic front, saying, "The police were absolutely right. This has never happened before, but it was clear to me from the start that there was something very wrong. The enthusiasm of the crowd was building much too early." After a 10-minute delay, Blackwell told the crowd the concert would continue if they remained in their seats. Specs Howard and Harry Martin were brought on stage to tell the audience to remain sitting, and shortly afterwards, the show continued.
I think that that answer is obvious. I certainly do not feel the same toward them as I did, and I hope that they never come back to town. I don't think that they can. Someone told me that they couldn't even read musical notes. They did make a lot of noise, and I suppose they did the best that they could to entertain. This frenzy that developed there, it's impossible for us to tell why those children became so frenzied and because they became so disorderly. Frankly, I hope that the next group comparable to these fellas come to town and go away with a better feeling toward the police. And I certainly hope that their audiences behave themselves better.
Thank you very much.
It is finally time for us to return to England. If only for the sake of brevity. It would take a tremendous amount of time to describe the unprecedented pandemonium that occurred almost every single day of the US tour. Tramplings, fans mobbing and breaking down doors, even a bomb threat. The only rest they received was a brief stay in Alton, Missouri, where they went horseback riding. Between the recording of Babies in Black and their return to England, they played in 27 locations. It was finally time for a short break, and they would come back to the studio on Tuesday, the 29th of August. To say the Beatles were pressed for material would be an understatement. Despite having the talent to write during tour, they barely had time to breathe and sleep, let alone write.
It was just one giant three-ring circus from which there was no let-up. The only peace they got was when they were alone in their hotel rooms, hearing the screams outside.
At this time, the Beatles were still considered to be a potential flash in the pan, and the higher-ups had one objective: keep the money going. That is not to say the Beatles were wholly taken advantage of. They themselves were fond of money, and immense workaholics. But the schedule that had been pressed upon them had stifled their creativity, and they had no choice but to get to work on the next LP. They recorded 3 songs on this day, the first of which was to be Every Little Thing. They put down 4 takes, although George was late for the session and so did not play on the song. Next up was I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, a country-flavored song that was mostly a Lennon write. The song was originally written with Ringo in mind, and in fact, in recollection, Paul actually remembered the song as a Ringo song. Ringo had a great style and great delivery, He had a lot of fans, so we like to write something for him on each album. I Don't Want to Spoil the Party is quite a nice little song, co-written by John and I. It sounds more like John than me, so 80-20 to him. Certain songs were inspirational and certain songs were work. It didn't mean they were any less fun to write. It was just a craft. And this was a job to order really, which Ringo did a good job on. Why Lennon took over the lead is unknown and may have been a last-moment decision. Perhaps it was due to the fact that Lennon personally identified to the song more than Paul thought. In a 1970 interview with Ray Connolly, Lennon stated, "That was me. You see, they're all personal, mine, when you get down to it." Finally, they went to work on What You're Doing. What You're Doing was a bit of filler. I think it was a little more mine than John's, but I don't have a very clear recollection, so to be on the safe side, I'd put it as 50-50. It doesn't sound like an idea that I remember John offering, so it just sounds like a way to get a song started. Some of them are just that, "Hey, what you doing?" You sometimes start a song and hope the best bit will arrive by the time you get to the chorus, but sometimes that's all you get, and I suspect this was one of them. Maybe it's a better recording than it is a song. Some of them are. And speaking of the recording, the guitars on the song received far more distortion than was typical at the time. Why this decision was made has not been clarified.
The light's on.
I know it is. So?
And don't slow down for Christ's sake.
Let's keep it
Or I'm
down.
giving you no more drugs.
Been for a shit, I see, Megan.
Take one, no reply.
This happened once before. I came to your door. No reply.
Every little thing was improved upon on Wednesday, and they apparently had a pretty good time of it. Take 6 was aborted when Paul belched out a vocal line, and uproarious laughter ensued. An instrument new to Beatles recordings was utilized, with Ringo playing some timpani. Next, the Beatles remade What You're Doing, dissatisfied with the version from the day before. The last song worked was Lennon's No Reply, which along with Babies in Black is one of my favorites from the album. That's my song. Dick James, the publisher, said, "That's the first complete song you've written where it resolves itself. You know, with a complete story. It was my version of Silhouettes. I had that image of walking down the street and seeing her silhouetted in the window and not answering the phone. Although I never called a girl on the phone in my life, because phones weren't part of the English child's life. Silhouettes was a 1957 track by the Rays, and the opening lines of the song bear a resemblance to No Reply.
I walked past your house late last night.
The song was actually written earlier in the year, originally to be given to Tommy Quickly.
Hello. My name's Tommy Quickly, and this is my dog.
And a demo version of this original exists.
Cause you walk hand in hand with another man. Your face.
Tommy Quickly, fortunately in my mind, never released the track. It only took 5 takes for the recording to be perfect. The weekend was spent rehearsing and performing for the television show Shindig. I find this interesting just because they played I'm a Loser, which had not yet been released.
One I have lost. There is one love I should never have lost. She was a girl.
Although I have not found this quoted by any other person, Lennon claims that 8 Days a Week originated from the early production planning for the movie Help. The original proposed title was to be 8 Arms to Hold You, a title that had been suggested by Ringo. However, this was not confirmed to be the case until March 1965, so while it is very possible that Ringo had coined the title all the way back in October of 1964, it is also possible that Lennon misremembered, as like I said before, Paul nor any other around the Beatles has associated 8 Days a Week with the working title 8 Arms to Hold You. In fact, Paul himself has 2 different versions of where the term originated. I usually drove myself there, but the chauffeur drove me out that day and I said, "How you been?" "Oh, working hard," he said, "working 8 days a week." I had never heard anyone use that expression, so when I arrived at John's house I said, "Hey, this fella just said 8 days a week." John said, "Right, "Ooh, I Need Your Love, Babe," and we wrote it. Then, in another recollection, Paul remembered the quote as coming from Ringo. Yeah, he said it as though he were an overworked chauffeur, 8 days a week. When we heard it, we said, "Really? Bing, got it." So the truth is very murky. If anyone out there has additional information I'm missing, please let me know. The early takes of this song were far different than the end result. The faded up introduction, considered to be the first pop song to do so, was not an idea they had envisioned at the start of the recording.
Take 2.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The session tapes also reveal another song percolating, Lennon's "I Feel Fine," and you can hear him strumming its distinctive riff between takes. Paul McCartney's "She's a Woman" is a song that sounds exceedingly simple on the surface. It's a raw vocal performance with a choppy, rhythmic pulse, but those unaccompanied chords throughout the song cause some trouble for the band. Let's hear again from musicologist Alan Pollock. The outtakes also show that the unaccompanied chords played on the offbeat were sufficiently clever to trip up the group virtually every time. Even the flawless official version maintains the power to throw you, the listener, off base a bit no matter how many times you've heard it. An hypnotic mantra-like effect is created by the fourfold reiteration of the distinctive hook phrase over the course of this section. The only other contrasting melodic material comes in little phrases that move stepwise around a single note, and these too are repeated to hypnotic effect. And what does Paul have to say? John did a very good thing. Instead of playing through it and putting like a watercolor wash over it all with his guitar, he just stabbed on the offbeats. Ringo would play the snare and John did it with the guitar, which was good. It left a lot of space for the rest of the stuff. "She's a Woman" was also perhaps the first Beatles song to contain a reference to drugs. "Turn me on when I get lonely" was supposedly Lennon's line. We put in the words, "turn me on." We were so excited to say, "turn me on." You know, about marijuana and all that, using it as an expression. They put down 7 takes of the song, and deemed take 6 as the best. What time is it, you may ask? Time to hunker down and finish the LP? Nope, it's tour time again, this time in Britain. Oh, and also John Lennon's 24th birthday. No breaks for you, Mr. Lennon. They wouldn't return to the studio until October 18th, though George Martin and Norman Smith had worked on the mixes for the recorded songs in the meanwhile. The Beatles at this point were still completely hands-off to that facet of the process. Not that they would have had the time anyways. How about a one-take recording? Well, technically 2, but take 1 of the recording of Kansas City, Hey 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 Hey, was deemed the superior as the Beatles sat down to play and knocked it out in one go. True professionals. They followed that up with a remake of Mr. Moonlight, still clearly struggling to find their footing with the song, and had not yet added the Hammond organ. The next song, though, was not to be a struggle, as sometimes the best songs come the easiest. Lennon's "I Feel Fine" does not sound like the rest of the music they were recording in this period. In fact, it sounds distinctly different from any song they had recorded to date. The Beatles continued to make subtle but noticeable pivots in their music, these slight evolutions which helped to define their music going forward.
They were. John put, and so they were electric, they were acoustic, semi-electrics, they had electric facilities, I think. And John leaned his against the amplifier, yeah. And then we were just going to go on and talk about the song, and suddenly the A string started feeding back at us. We were just, what? Can you do that? You know, they said, George, well, yes, I did it on the front or something. So
but he figured out how to do it, you know, because we used to do it on stage then, live. So John figured out, you know, you just had to hit the A, and I get it by the buzzing by the amp.
So that was the start of all that
way,
Hendrix
feedback. He invented Jimi Hendrix.
It probably was, actually, you know. Well, you know, once you see somebody messing with feedback, it's a whole field of research, isn't it, as it became later.
I wrote "I Feel Fine" around the riff which is going on in the background. I tried to get that effect into practically every song on the LP, but the others wouldn't have it. I told them that I'd write a song specifically for this riff, so they said, yes, you go away and do that. Anyway, going into the studio one morning, I said to Ringo, I've written this song, but it's lousy. But we tried it, complete with the riff, and it sounded like an A-side, so we decided to release it just like that. That distinctive riff was played by both John and George during the recording. George, the guitar riff was actually influenced by a record called What's Your Step by Bobby Parker, but all the riffs in that tempo have a similar sound. John played it, and all I did was play it as well, and it became the double-tracked sound. I Follow the Sun is actually one of the earliest songs ever written by Paul McCartney, written in 1959 at his family home. I was about 16. I'll Follow the Sun was one of those very early ones. I seem to remember writing it just after I'd had the flu and I had that cigarette. I smoked when I was 16. The cigarette that's the cotton wool one. You don't smoke while you're ill, but after you get better you have a cigarette and it's terrible. It tastes like cotton wool. Horrible. I remember standing in the parlor with my guitar, looking out through the lace curtains of the window and writing that one. A rough home recording of the song exists, believed to date from spring 1960. They spent 11 takes on the song, with take 8 being deemed the best. The percussion on the song did not come from Ringo's drum set. Rather, well, depending on what year you asked Paul, the answer is different. In 1964, he said Ringo played a packing case, but many years later, he said Ringo tapped his knees. I'm more inclined to believe the former. The Beatles rounded off the day with 3 more songs, and a total of 5 takes for all of them. Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby took 1 take, as did Rock and Roll Music. It was only Buddy Holly's Words of Love that took more than 1, as they polished it off by take 3. Clearly, the Beatles were very experienced playing these songs. The Beatles hopped right back into tour the next day and continued to play through Britain while the engineer team worked on the mixes. It wasn't till the 26th of October that the Beatles came back to finish the LP. They began with Carl Perkins' Honey Don't, a song until that point had always been sung by Lennon on stage. But seeing as John took over the song originally intended for Ringo, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, it was crucial that Ringo have at least 1 vocal on the record. The boys then tried a remake of What You're Doing, now reaching 19 takes, and then finally they recorded just as you all have been waiting for, the Christmas special for their official fan club, singing carols and telling some wacky jokes.
Jingle bell. Hello everybody, this is Paul, and I'd just like to thank you all for buying our records during the past year. It'll be a big laugh, we hope. Well, big laugh. Yeah, it'll be a big laugh.
You and Megan?
Oh, can you
wash your father's shirt, or can you wash it clean? Or can you wash your father's shirt, or can you wash it clean? Christmas! Christmas!
And with that climax, the sessions for what would become Beatles for Sale ended. The British tour went on, and of course was a huge success. The chaos that plagued the US tour was still there, just to a far more controlled degree in comparison. I Feel Fine hit the US on November 23rd and November 27th in the UK. It would spend 3 weeks at number 1 in the US and 5 weeks in the UK. On December 2nd, Ringo had his tonsils removed. The world was forever changed.
Why exactly have you come here? What's the trouble with you?
He's joking, isn't he? I've got a bit of a... Well, I haven't got a bad throat, but the doctor thinks I have. He wants me to get me tonsils out, you see.
Has this been troubling you wrong?
No, the last time I was in here was the first real trouble I had.
I see.
I feel fine.
How long do you intend being here?
Plugging it, you know.
Jimmy Nichols stood in for him during the tour. And then, on December 21st, Beatles for Sale was released. It would debut at number 1, knocking off A Hard Day's Night, which was still at number 1 until this point. The album cover was photographed sometime in October at Hyde Park by the Albert Memorial. The photographer was Robert Freeman, who shot both the covers for With the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night, and would go on to photograph the covers for both Help and Rubber Soul in the following year. There persists this narrative of the album cover reflecting the Beatles' exhaustion and the somber tone of the album itself, which, this is obviously just my personal opinion, but I have always thought that that was a bit silly. The Beatles assumed a similar expression for With the Beatles and Rubber Soul, yet we do not put that projection upon those albums. I am sure the Beatles were tired. 1964 in particular was an exhausting year, and they were at the tail end of it.
If you look at any of those books that say where the Beatles were working, you find we hardly ever had a day off, you know, and we'd have to complain to Brian. He'd have all the pressure of people saying, yeah, we want to book the Beatles, want to book, I've got to have them, making him offers he couldn't refuse. We were having to say, we've got to have a day off, man.
But surely, in no way did they come together with the photographer and say, we're tired, and the album sounds somber. Let's look depressed. The Beatles experienced a lot of difficulties while on tour, namely being trapped in hotel rooms and having the inability to go anywhere at all. They were snuck and smuggled from location to location and almost never had a moment to breathe. But the Beatles also thrived in this environment.
We didn't get any time off. You know, we seemed to get 5 minutes off here and there. It might have been longer than that, but it felt like 5 minutes. But that was okay.
It wasn't until 1965 that the touring cracks really began to show. The weaknesses in this album, especially the number of cover tracks, reflects the lack of time they had, more than being burnt out. In the time they did have, they still managed to write quite a few excellent songs, and if they had more time, I'm sure the album would be stronger. The Beatles probably were not passionately involved in this album. In total, they spent 7 days recording. That's it. It was simply part of the business. More material, more money, Beatles for sale. An incredibly apt title. Despite this, their sound evolved and their songwriting abilities continued to grow, onward and upward. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you again for watching.